That's equivalent to one state budget, that's equivalent to your state income taxes, wasted for 30 years. But it gets worse. Because the things that you do pay for, you don't even get. So, you pay for border security every year. Well, guess what? You don't get it. Federal government never puts enough of the people and personnel on the border to adequately protect the border. So the state government dips into the CHP and State Policing Foundation to provide for extra personnel at the borders that you could have adequate border security. So that's a double tax. You pay the feds, they don't do it. So you have to reach into your own state tax and dip into that resources and pull it here. That's a 200% tax. But it gets worse. Because when you pay for national emergencies, every year we have forest fires, hundreds of homes burned, sometimes people die. Federal government doesn't come out and help. Forest fires in LA, and sometimes the rest of the Sierras, Nevadas, are called a national emergency because of the scale. Federal government admits they're a national emergency. Federal government doesn't help. Governor Schwarzenegger was the first one to start this trend. And what it is that we pay money into the federal government for national emergency assistance for fire season. We get nothing. So then they have to dip into the state budget to take money to pay other states to borrow helicopters and personnel so that you actually have the adequate amount of firefighting potential every year. That's another 200% tax. Because you're paying for something, you don't get it, dip into state resources, resupply it, 200% tax. But it gets worse. Because another thing that every nation in the world is supposed to do is provide for national security. Every country in the world provides that, except yours and to you. Did you know that for 5 years is in half a decade, after 9/11, you never got your 9/11 security money? You got nothing. Director of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff, when he retired, said that California was the most terrorist-sensitive location in all of America. And yet you got none of your 9/11 security money. It went to other states. They pretty much wasted it. That Director of Homeland Security said that. Interesting. Why would that happen? So, do you know who actually paid for you to get nuclear radiation detectors at the seaports to make sure you weren't blown up by terrorists? You did. There was a special local truckers tax coming out of things in the LA ports and the Oakland ports, $20 on a container, which meant the cost of local goods went up, which is a tax indirectly on you. So you pay for national security, it doesn't happen, then you pay this extra surcharge on additional goods in your local area, that's a 200% tax. And for something like not being blown up by nuclear bombs, you would think that in the years after 9/11, when we're saying that America's fighting terror, that this would be a priority, but it just wasn't. They weren't going to do anything about it until you did it for yourself. But it gets worse. Because the federal government is supposed to be what's called the lender of last resort, which means that if you're in trouble as a smaller state economy and you need help or bailout, you're supposed to be able to go to the feds and they're supposed to be able to help you. Now what I want you to think is, what is 30 times 80 to $120 billion? You've paid into this account for 30 years. Does everybody remember 2 years ago when Governor Schwarzenegger went to the president and asked for a bailout? We got nothing. If you look at the national newspapers, you got ridicule. They said California is a bunch of spin-happy, liberal, no discipline, bleeding heart liberals, and they put themselves in this situation and they get everything that they deserve. Forbes magazine said that, MSNBC, CNN, everybody. So, you pay 30 years into this account, $80 to $120 billion. 1 year, you ask for $20 billion for a short-term loan. You get ridicule instead, and nothing. And it gets worse, because what they're finding out is that the federal government could never bail out California ever, even if it wanted to. The California economy is simply too large for the federal government to ever be what's called the lender of last resort, which means the main bank. So you're paying for an insurance policy that you can never cash in. But it gets worse. Because we've been in this recession for about 3 to 5 years. California is the worst hit state in all of America for this recession, and the worst recession that we've seen in a century. So, California when we have Governor Schwarzenegger, he went to Asia, met with different Asian companies, with California businesses. They worked out the negotiations, they signed the contracts, they got everything approved. Comes back, goes to George W. Bush. Would you please approve these trade deals that'll be 100,000 new jobs for California? George W. Bush sits on this for 5 years. And unfortunately, the current president, Barack Obama, also sat on these trade deals for 5 years. George W. Bush, Barack Obama, to California, the exact same president. I know that sounds radical, but when we're in the middle of a recession and we're the worst hit state and we have a way to get ourselves out of this and we would say, please just approve these trade deals. Too busy. 5 years too busy, next president 5 years too busy. Happened. It's a fact. Now, here's the kicker. Besides California's problems, there's a whole other set of problems on a level worse than anything you just heard in the last 5 minutes. And this is the other half of California's next century. So in the next 20 to 40 years, there are going to be new superpowers with as much money and power as America. Not that America's going down, but that new countries are coming up. In the future, their names will be China, India, Brazil, Russia, and possibly a Southeast Asian collective known as ASEAN, ASEAN, in addition to the EU and the US. So what happens in a future when America is not the only superpower, but only one of 7? Well, let me add a little bit of context to that. After World War II, America entered into a long-term war with the USSR called the Cold War. And most of the world was broken up into democracy and capitalism, or communism and sort of control over the state. That made a lot of countries side with America because it seemed to be the better two of the alternatives. But something happened in the late 80s, early 90s. America became the victim of its own success. It won the Cold War. And now everybody thinks that some form of democracy and some form of capitalism is the way to go. Let's take a look at China. China has democracy. It's at a very low level, at the community level, not at the higher one, and China's capitalist. They trade, they love making money, and they do deals with America. But they are not America. So what happens in the future when there's not one, but now 7 versions of democracy and capitalism? Can you be sure that the world will choose the American version? Side with America's perspective when there's 6 others offering the exact same thing?